Imagine this, a couple lies tangled beneath the sheets, breath still heavy with the echo of climax. But even as their bodies ache with satiation, something lingers in the silence, a disquiet and invisible rift neither touch nor kiss can bridge. He turns away, she closes her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the raw intensity of union dissolves into a vacuum of meaninglessness. Was it just biology? Was it just the predictable choreography of pleasure and release? If so, why does it sometimes feel like something eternal has stirred, and other times, nothing at all? Sex is not merely an act of pleasure. It never was. It is a ritual cloaked in paradox, suspended between flesh and spirit, the animal and the divine. We live in a time where sex has been dissected into mere mechanics, positions, techniques, performance. It is commercialized, sold in pixels, and stripped bare of its deeper resonance. Yet, beneath this cultural anesthesia, there persists a haunting whisper: this matters more than we're willing to admit. Carl Jung once suggested that modern man is lonely because he has no myth. We have demystified sex, and, in doing so, we have abandoned one of our last remaining doorways into the sacred. What was once templed in ritual, woven into initiations, oaths, and the pulse of collective psyche, has become recreational. And though pleasure remains, something vital has been lost. The ancient world didn't make this mistake. In Hindu tantric tradition, sex wasn't a detour from spiritual life, it was spiritual life. The union of masculine and feminine energies, Shiva and Shakti, was understood as a cosmic principle. In Egyptian temples, sacred prostitutes served as priestesses of Isis, merging soul and body in acts that transcended moral reductionism. Even in early Christian Gnosticism, there were sects that believed in hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, as a symbol of inner transformation. So how did we fall so far? Arthur Schopenhauer, the ever-pessimistic sage, believed that sexuality was the will to life incarnate, an unstoppable, often cruel force that overrides reason and enslaves men to nature. Yet even he couldn't deny its metaphysical pull. For Schopenhauer, sex was the only moment when our illusion of individuality collapses and something larger than ourselves takes over. We become both more and less than human. This is the central paradox. Sex is the most animalistic thing we do, and yet it's also the most transcendental. In the ecstasy of the act, we are stripped bare of pretense, of ego, of control. And in that nakedness, there's terror, yes, but also truth. Why else would Sartre write that hell is other people and yet still obsess over sexual possession as a form of existential conquest? We cannot touch another body without, on some level, revealing the most secret corners of our psyche. We cannot be entered or enter without confronting our longing to dissolve the walls of separateness. Sex, at its core, is not about pleasure, it's about transcendence. About ceasing, even if only for a second, to be a self-contained I. And this is precisely why it terrifies us. To make love is to open a doorway not just to someone else, but to the deep, churning waters of our own unconscious. It is to risk being seen, not just by another, but by oneself, stripped of the masks we wear in daylight. It's no accident that many weep after sex or feel inexplicable sorrow. It is the echo of something larger than us brushing up against the membrane of our humanity. Viktor Frankl, the man who survived hell and still found meaning, wrote, "Love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality." Sex, when sacred, becomes the physical expression of that grasping, not a conquest, but a communion. Not a taking, but a trembling offering. Yet how do we return to the sacredness when the world teaches us only to consume? That is the question we must now begin to unravel. The tragedy is not that modern society has lost its sacred rituals. The tragedy is that we've replaced them with imitations, pale, lifeless replicas. We haven't stopped worshiping. We've simply redirected our altars. Now, it is sacrificed to algorithms, swallowed by the infinite scroll, diluted into a pixelated commodity. What once led us into the temple now leads us into transactional encounters void of mystery. We live in an age of hyperstimulation and existential emptiness. We crave more sensation, yet feel less alive. Swipe, match, ghost, repeat, the dance of digital intimacy. The very technology that promises connection has delivered us into a wilderness of solitude. 1,000 faces, 1,000,000 bodies, yet rarely a soul truly met. Sex, in this landscape, becomes not a meeting of two depths, but an escape from depth altogether. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that we seek to possess others through sex because we fear our own contingency. We use the other to affirm our existence, to avoid the vacuum of selfhood. But in trying to own the other, we kill the possibility of true union. What if, instead, sex was not about possession but presence? Not an escape from loneliness, but a portal into a more profound aloneness. Shared, paradoxically, with another, Aldous Huxley, visionary and critic of modernity, warned that the future would be filled not with oppression, but with amusement. Men do not rebel against their distractions, he wrote, and nowhere is this more obvious than in our approach to sex. It is endlessly available, yet endlessly elusive. We are flooded with erotica and starved for eros. The sacred, the poetic, the ineffable. Eros is not the same as lust. Lust can be blind, compulsive, rooted in fear. Eros is vision. It is the capacity to see the beloved not just as flesh but as symbol, as mystery, as portal. Eros is the flame that draws the soul into ecstasy. Not just orgasmic release, but a trembling nearness to the divine. It's the look that says, I see you, not just your body, but the ghost that walks inside it. Yet our culture fears the weight of such a gaze. We are more comfortable consuming than consecrating. To sacralize sex is to slow down, to open, to risk. And in a world allergic to silence and allergic to stillness, the sacred feels unbearable. We would rather be stimulated than transformed. What we do not revere, we reduce. And sex, once a sacred fire, has been reduced to a utility. A way to feel something, control something, escape something. We are told to be empowered, yet taught to perform. We are told to explore, yet rarely to feel. We celebrate liberation, but remain prisoners to superficiality. But something in us remembers. Even amidst the noise, the soul recalls what the body knows in its bones, that sex was never meant to be casual. Not because it is morally wrong, but because it is existentially potent. Because it changes us subtly or violently, gently or painfully, it leaves its mark. Every encounter leaves an imprint on the psyche like water etching into stone. To desacralize sex is to desacralize the self. And we are now living in the ruins of that desecration. Empty beds, numb hearts, performance without intimacy. Bodies touched but souls untouched. But if sex can wound us so deeply, could it not also heal us just as profoundly? The question lingers like incense in a forgotten chapel. If desecration is the wound, then sanctification is the path. But to sanctify, we must first remember what we've forgotten, that sex was never just about sensation. It was about surrender, about death and rebirth, about entering the fire and letting the ego burn. There's a moment just before two bodies meet when time hesitates, when breath holds itself like a prayer waiting to be uttered. In that space, the sacred reveals itself. And yet, most rush through it, terrified of what stillness might unveil. We mistake speed for passion, noise for intimacy, friction for connection. But the body is not a machine. It is an altar. To treat sex as sacred is to remember that the body is not just skin and sinew. It is the vessel of the divine. Every curve, every scar, every tremble holds the memory of stars, dust, and ancestry. The body carries history, trauma, joy, and longing. It speaks in gestures, in aches, in pulses of desire that come not only from the loins but from the soul. This is why sex, at its highest expression, becomes a kind of embodied theology. Communion, not just with another, but with something far more ancient and ineffable. It is the point where flesh and spirit blur, where our mortality becomes a passageway to eternity. As Viktor Frankl reminded us, life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning. When sex loses meaning, we suffer, not just emotionally, but spiritually. There is a reason ancient mystics spoke of ecstasy using the same language as lovers. Teresa of Avila's divine raptures sound almost erotic. He appeared to me, and I saw in his hands a long golden spear. It seemed as if he plunged it into my heart several times. The pain was so great that I could not help but moan. What she described was not carnal, but cosmic. Yet it shows us how blurred the lines can be between sacred union and sacred surrender. To offer oneself fully to another, naked not just in body but in being, is one of the most terrifying acts of courage we can undertake. It requires that we lay down our weapons, our personas, our defenses, our fear of being unlovable. And in return, we receive not just pleasure, but revelation. Sex, when sanctified, does not just satisfy the body. It awakens the soul. Carl Jung spoke of the anima and animus, the feminine within the man, the masculine within the woman. He believed true union could only occur when we recognize these archetypes within ourselves and others. In this view, sacred sex becomes a ritual of integration, the balancing of opposites, the inner marriage. Each encounter is a mirror, each lover a guide, revealing parts of us we've buried or forgotten. But the modern sexual landscape fears mirrors. We prefer shadows, ephemeral, thrilling, but ultimately empty. We fear the vulnerability that sacredness demands. We fear being seen not as idealized images, but as we truly are, wounded, yearning, unfinished. And yet, it is precisely this rawness that makes the act holy. To move towards sacred sex is to reject performance in favor of presence. It is to slow down, to listen not just with ears but with skin, with breath. It is to trace each inch of the other as if writing a psalm with fingertips. It is to breathe not just into each other's mouths, but into each other's wounds. It is to look deeply and say, I am not here to conquer you, I am here to witness you. Arthur Schopenhauer saw sex as the will to life, a force beyond reason. But what he missed, perhaps, was its capacity to refine that will. When approached with reverence, sex becomes not compulsion, but consecration. Not just the drive to propagate, but the invitation to transform. This isn't about morality. This isn't about repression. It's about reclaiming something we've lost. The body is not an obstacle to the sacred, it is the sacred. To touch another human being is to touch a fragment of the divine, trembling and breakable, yes, but also infinite. And when we begin to remember this, everything changes. There's a moment in sacred intimacy when the boundaries dissolve, not just the line between your body and theirs, but between who you think you are and something vast, wordless, unknown. It is not comfort. It is not control. It is the death of the ego. We often speak of falling in love or losing ourselves in the throes of passion. But rarely do we ask, what is being lost? In truth, it is the illusion of separateness. That brittle mask we wear in our daily lives, curated, armored. Terrified is stripped away. And in its place, for a fleeting instant, we touch something terrifyingly beautiful, the possibility that we are not alone. That we are not merely observers of life, but participants in a mystery that far exceeds our comprehension. Nietzsche warned, be careful when you gaze into the abyss, for the abyss gazes also into you. What he may not have known is that the same is true of love, of sex, of intimacy at its deepest. When you look deeply into another during sacred union, you don't just see them, you see yourself reflected back, distorted, magnified, exposed. All the unhealed wounds, all the yearnings, all the unloved parts of you that surface when you finally allow yourself to be vulnerable. To let someone see you fully is a kind of death. And sex, when it transcends mechanics, becomes a crucifixion of the self. The performative I must die so that something new may emerge, a we that is not just physical but existential. This is the meaning behind ancient rites of sacred union. They weren't just ceremonies of fertility, they were rehearsals for ego death. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential philosophy reminds us that the self is constantly being constructed through choices, through the gaze of the other. And what is sex if not the ultimate confrontation with that gaze? In the sacred act, the other's eyes are not just instruments of pleasure or validation, they are mirrors, sometimes merciless, sometimes tender, that reflect who we are beneath our persona. That is why many people fear real intimacy. Not because of what it demands, but because of what it reveals. It's easier to live on the surface, to keep the lights dim, to turn bodies into objects, to keep the encounter transactional. Because if sex becomes sacred, then so do we. And to be sacred is to be responsible for our own wholeness, our own truth, our own longing. In the moment of climax, if it is not just release, but surrender, time shatters. There is no past, no future, only the infinite now. Some mystics called this the little death, not merely for its physical sensation, but for what it symbolized, the ego undone, the soul glimpsed. The French term, la petite mort, doesn't describe exhaustion. It describes transformation. This transformation is not always gentle. To make love consciously is to invite the unconscious to the surface. Old wounds rise. Abandonment, shame, fear of rejection, they all crawl into the bed with us. But here lies the power. When these shadows are met with presence, with trust, with reverence, they begin to heal. Sex becomes not just pleasure, but a sacred therapy of the soul. Carl Jung believed that healing happens through integration, not avoidance. Sacred sex is precisely this. It brings the dark and the light into the same room. It says, here I am, all of me, and invites the other to do the same. Not to fix or to change, but to witness, to hold, to allow. This is why sacred sex is so rare. Because it requires more than technique. It demands truth. It asks us to undress not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. It invites us to step into the fire and allow the false self to burn. And in the ashes, something unnameable begins to rise. There are certain moments in life when time itself seems to fracture. When a kiss, a moan, a silent gaze can stretch into eternity. In these moments, we are no longer merely human. We are instruments played by something ancient, something outside language. In sacred sex, this phenomenon becomes alchemy. The merging of two distinct psyches into a singular, luminous experience, something more than chemistry, something like transfiguration. To the untrained eye, it might look like passion. But underneath, something far more mysterious is unfolding. It is a kind of metaphysical experiment, to enter another without losing oneself, to be transformed without being destroyed. It is a paradox that only the sacred can hold. Aldous Huxley once wrote, "We can only love what we know, and we can never know completely what we do not love." Sacred sex becomes the very medium through which this paradox is lived. For in the nakedness of the body, there is a deeper knowing, one that bypasses intellect, one that does not measure or define, but feels with the entirety of being. This knowing is eros in its highest form, the drive not to possess, but to merge, to transcend. When two souls meet with reverence, something third is born. It is not a child, necessarily. It is a field, an energy, a holy presence that did not exist before. Poets have spoken of it. Mystics have bowed to it. And in those rare moments when we are fully present with another, body, mind, soul, we too can feel it. It's no longer you and I. It is us, but even us dissolves into something beyond human grammar. The union becomes symbolic, archetypal. It's not just two lovers. It is the eternal masculine and eternal feminine dancing in the firelight of creation. Whether gay, straight, or non-binary, this polarity exists not in gender but in essence, active and receptive, solar and lunar, expansion and surrender. In sacred sex, these forces swirl and unify, not to cancel each other, but to become one. Carl Jung saw individuation, the process of becoming whole, as the deepest human aim. Sacred sex plays an essential role in this journey. In the mirror of the beloved, we confront our projections, our wounds, our shadow. But we also glimpse our divine twin, the lost part of ourselves we've been seeking not only in others but within. And through love, through presence, through sacred eroticism, we begin to reclaim those pieces. In those rare, luminous moments, orgasm ceases to be a mere climax. It becomes dissolution. The French were not wrong to call it la petite mort, the little death. For in that moment, the false self falls away. The chatter stops. Identity ceases. And something vast, formless, and holy rushes in. Some have called it God. Others, the void. But all agree it is no longer just sex. It is transcendence. Arthur Schopenhauer saw sex as the cruel trick of nature to perpetuate the species. But he missed the nuance. Yes, sex binds us to the body, but it also opens us to something that exceeds it. It reminds us that we are not just organisms fighting for survival. We are conscious beings aching to merge with something greater. Something eternal. To approach sex as sacred is to treat the other not as a means to pleasure, but as a gateway to the infinite. Each touch becomes a prayer. Each breath an invocation. Each climax, a brief tearing of the veil between the known and the ineffable. And what emerges is not just pleasure, but healing. Not just excitement, but grace. Not just union with the other, but a deeper union with oneself and, perhaps, with the divine. Yet even this is not the end of the journey. Because the sacred is not static. It is a path. And now we must ask, what kind of world might we create if we walk that path together? Imagine a world where lovers treat each other as sacred texts, pages written not in ink but in scars, laughter, and breath. Imagine touch not as a transaction but as revelation. In this world, intimacy is not a means to satisfaction but a doorway to soul. The question is not what can I get from you, but who can we become together? We do not live in that world yet, but we carry the memory of it buried in the silence between heartbeats. In a culture addicted to distraction, where porn is more accessible than love, where pleasure is confused with connection, where numbness is mistaken for strength, the sacredness of sex becomes a radical act of remembering. To remember is to return, to remember, to bring the broken parts back into wholeness. And we begin not by blaming the culture, but by turning inward. Asking, where have I desecrated myself? Where have I given away my body without bringing my soul? Where have I been used? Or stayed silent in the presence of something that deserved to be holy? These questions are not comfortable, but they are necessary, because healing cannot happen without truth. And truth, when spoken aloud in the sacred space of intimacy, becomes liberation. Viktor Frankl taught that the ultimate human freedom lies in our ability to choose meaning even in suffering. Sacred sex is not about perfect technique or enlightened partners. It is about intention, about choosing to make each encounter, no matter how fleeting, a space of presence. Not performance, not escapism, but encounter. It may begin in a whisper, a hand held with reverence, an eye contact that doesn't look away, a confession of fear, a slow undressing not just of clothes, but of pretense. These small moments become altars, and on them we place our most honest offerings. We begin to speak the forgotten language of the body, not the language of conquest, but of communion. Each freckle becomes a syllable, each curve a verse, each sigh a hymn. In this liturgy, there is no room for shame, only awe. And from awe, love is born. Not the clinging kind, but the kind that sees clearly, that honors without needing to possess. Jean-Paul Sartre, despite his often bleak view of existence, understood that human beings are condemned to freedom. We must choose. Always. Even in love. Especially in love. Sacred sex is a choice, not to dominate or dissolve into another, but to co-create an experience that reflects something higher. A moment where the sacred becomes visible if only for an instant. But how do we protect the sacredness in a world so eager to commercialize and commodify everything? The answer is not withdrawal, but presence. We reclaim the sacred not by rejecting desire, but by redeeming it. By learning to see the divine flickering behind the eyes of a lover. By holding space for both ecstasy and tears. By honoring the body not as object, but as oracle. The journey is not linear. We will forget. We will falter. We will find ourselves in moments that feel anything but holy. But even then, the path is not lost. Every encounter is a chance to return. Every breath a bridge. The philosopher Plotinus wrote, "We must close our eyes and invoke a new way of seeing, a wakefulness that is the birthright of us all." Sacred sex is not the privilege of the enlightened few, it is the birthright of anyone willing to feel deeply, to love bravely, to show up fully. This is not about religion. It is about reverence. It is about choosing, again and again, to treat our bodies and the bodies of those we love not as distractions from the divine, but as doorways into it. So let the bed become a sanctuary. Let your hands become sacraments. Let your desire become devotion. Because sex isn't just pleasure, it's sacred. And when we remember that, we remember who we truly are.